Hi everybody. Today we're going to pick up with the last part of our lecture on American imperialism in the late 1800s, and all the classes should be at about the same point in the lecture. If you have not yet watched the video on the annexation of Hawaii, go ahead and do that first. That's the last piece of our last lecture, and then you can move on to this last part of the notes. So let's start talking about the ultimate goal of taking territories in the Pacific, which is to get our foot in the door to trading with China. One of the things that was going on in China before the United States got involved there was that European powers were establishing what are called spheres of influence in China. And Secretary of State John Hay is interested in getting involved in that same game, trying to carve out a place in China where the United States can trade its goods exclusively. A sphere of influence is when a country has exclusive trading rights in a certain region of another country. So at this point, European powers were dominating Chinese trade, and the United States wanted a piece of that action as well. You might remember learning last year about the very nefarious way that Britain got itself involved in Chinese trade. China and Japan were very resistant all throughout this period to trading with Europeans. And part of it was because they feared that trading with Europeans would lead to a watering down of their own culture. And the Chinese and the Japanese obviously are very proud of their cultural traditions and wanted to resist that outside influence. So they were hesitant to open up trade relationship with any European power. And Britain actually forced its way in with the really notorious strategy of trading opium to the Chinese, knowing that it's highly addictive and knowing that they would not be able to live without it once they got it. And so Britain starts by trading opium to the Chinese, and then that opens the door to them being able to trade other goods with the Chinese, because they can use it as leverage and say, if you don't trade other goods, if you don't buy other goods that we're trying to sell you, we'll stop shipping the opium. And so the Chinese government understands that opium is becoming a problem. It's a hugely addictive drug, and it's deteriorating the quality of life for Chinese people, and so they decide they're going to go to war with Britain over this. This leads to a series of conflicts known as the Opium Wars. Of course, the British Navy is far superior to the Chinese Navy, and the British Navy is able to easily defeat the Chinese in the Opium Wars. And so that pretty much cements Britain's access to trade in China. But because the United States is kind of late to the party, and all the other European powers already have exclusive trade contracts in China, Secretary of State John Hay pens a letter that says, guys, why don't we all have equal trading rights to China? What's this carving out special places and regions where you have exclusive rights? Let's all share. Let's have an open door in China when it comes to trade. And this will be something that will be beneficial to the United States, and it will be beneficial to everybody else. And given that the United States had shown recently in the Spanish-American War that it had a pretty strong navy and a military that was willing to fight, the other European powers sort of, they didn't agree to the open door policy, but they didn't oppose it either. And so what we see is the United States kind of forces its way into the Chinese marketplace as well with this concept of the open door policy. Now, I don't want you to believe that the Chinese took this lightly or that the Chinese just went along with this. There were a series of different rebellions. The Boxer Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion, but we'll talk specifically about the Boxer Rebellion here. There was a group of Chinese martial artists, I guess you could call them like MMA fighters, mixed martial arts warriors, and they rallied under the slogan, "Kill Foreign Devils." And the idea was that these patriots were going to fight to push out any foreign influence in China. And the United States actually saw this as a huge threat to its newly acquired trade relationship in China, and so the United States actually sends in the military to put down this rebellion. And although the Boxer Rebellion showed tremendous courage on the part of the Chinese, it did not ultimately succeed. So the United States has kind of forced its way into China. You may also remember learning last year that the United States had gained trade access in a port city in Japan, in Nagasaki, through Commodore Matthew Perry basically firing on the city with his Navy ships until the city capitulated. And so the United States has a bit of a reputation of forcing its way into trade with the Asian marketplace. And once it's there, it's going to stay there. And of course, now with the Philippines and with Guam and with Hawaii, we've got refueling stations and rest stops for all of our ships, both military and trade ships, that can get us from the west coast of the United States to the main trading ports of Asia. So let's take a look at President Roosevelt's foreign policy. It's often referred to as big stick diplomacy or the big stick policy, and this nickname comes from a quote that Teddy Roosevelt was fond of. It comes from an old African proverb that apparently he learned while he was over on safari, and it says, "Speak softly and carry a big stick and you'll go far." What does that mean? Well, his interpretation of it was that you don't always have to say what you're going to do, but you can demonstrate what your intentions are through sort of silent intimidation. And so speak softly and carry a big stick is be strong, be powerful, be ready to back up your claims, but you don't have to tell everybody what you're going to do. You don't have to threaten people with words. You can just show force, and people will understand that you're powerful and that you're not to be disagreed with. And that's really the essence of his foreign policy, is to show overwhelming American strength, overwhelming American firepower, and overwhelming American willingness to back up what we say. And I think a great example of this is the story of the Panama Canal. Now, I'm going to pause it after I give a couple notes on the Panama Canal. I've actually given you most of the notes here in your packet already, so we can move more quickly through this. And at the end of this, I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask you to watch a video on the Panama Canal. So, a little history on the Panama Canal. Several different European powers had tried to dig a canal through Panama. It's the narrowest passageway through Central America, and it would be the easiest crossing from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Why do you want to cross through Panama from the Atlantic to the Pacific? Well, because without a canal there, the only way to get from the east coast of the United States to the west coast by ship is to sail around the southern tip of South America, which takes a long time. And this was actually demonstrated in the Spanish-American War when a fleet of ships were going to the Philippines to back up Commodore Dewey's original fleet, and by the time they got to the Philippines, the war was over. So Teddy Roosevelt, as president, we had already talked about how he had been influenced by Alfred T. Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and Mahan was a huge advocate for digging a canal through Panama. And so Teddy Roosevelt makes this his #1 foreign policy goal. The United States actually tried to buy a piece of Panama to dig this canal. There was a French company that had the rights to dig a canal there, and the Colombian government actually owned Panama. Panama at the time was still part of Colombia. And so attempts to purchase this land to be able to dig the canal fail. And so, of course, when attempts to purchase things fail, what is the historical pattern? What does the United States do? Well, it usually uses force at that point, and this situation will be no different. And so a small rebellion incited by the head of this French company with some local Panamanians is stoked up. And we don't know exactly what role Teddy Roosevelt or the U.S. government played in inciting the riot. But we do know that there was communication, and we do know that there was definitely a wink and a nod from the United States, at the very least, that we would support this rebellion if it were to happen. And so the United States sends warships just off the coast of Panama while this rebellion is happening, and that blocks the Colombian government from being able to get in and put down the rebellion. So whether the United States was behind the rebellion or whether the United States just gave backup to support the rebellion is a bit of a debate. But the result of this is that Panama becomes an independent nation from Cuba, and how convenient, after they become an independent nation, they grant the United States a treaty which will allow us to build a canal. And not only that, but we get a 100-year lease to control a 10-mile zone around the canal. And to this day, there's no member of the Panamanian government that claims to have signed this agreement. We don't know where this agreement came from. All we know is that Teddy Roosevelt emerges with a 100-year lease to control the Panama Canal. So the United States is going to go to work on a controversial canal, obviously because of the way that we were able to get a hold of the land, but also it's a very difficult canal to build, and we're going to have to use a lot of engineering prowess, but also a lot of hard manual labor to get this done. And who are going to be the people who do most of that labor? Local Panamanians and other people from the surrounding countries. So it takes 10 years to complete this project. It's an engineering masterpiece. It's way ahead of its time in terms of the way that it works. And you'll see in the video how it works. It costs $350 million in the early 1900s. And so that would be the equivalent of $8 to $10 billion today. Major, major investment. And so what you'll see in the video is the way that this system of hydraulic locks actually raises the water level, because the Atlantic and the Pacific sit at different levels on either side of the Isthmus of Panama. And so you need these sort of water elevators to actually raise the ship up a little at a time to get it across. Obviously, the canal is going to be strategically important for military purposes and for trade, and you'll see in the video that even today the Panama Canal is a major, major crossing point for almost all of the trade routes that we still have in the world. So why don't you pause at this moment and take a look at the Panama Canal video. I've provided the URL on the announcements page of Blackboard. Welcome back. We're going to finish out these notes. I'm going to move fairly quickly through this to try to keep it under 15 minutes. Another important piece of Roosevelt's foreign policy is what becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember that the Monroe Doctrine said that the United States would reject any European powers colonizing in Latin America. Well, this takes that declaration one step further, because it allows the United States to have police powers in Latin America. And the idea is that we're going to protect not only the independence of our nearby neighbors, but we're also going to protect our trade relationships in Latin America and protect our control of the Panama Canal. And so this actually turns the Monroe Doctrine from a tool of neutrality, something that would keep the United States neutral in conflicts around the world, to a tool of intervention, which is actually going to give the United States justification to use military force more freely in Latin America. Another shining example of Teddy Roosevelt's style of foreign policy happens when a war breaks out between Russia and Japan called the Russo-Japanese War. And Teddy Roosevelt actually invites foreign ministers from Russia and Japan to come to the United States for peace talks. And he acts as a neutral peace broker. Well, he's not exactly neutral, because he wants to protect American trade in the Pacific, and so ending this war will protect American trade in the Pacific. But he invites a Russian and a Japanese diplomat to the United States, and he invites them to a very specific location, which is the naval base at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he has the peace meeting on the deck of a modern American battleship. And he does this very intentionally as part of his speak softly and carry a big stick policy. Intimidate, but don't state what your goals are. And he basically drapes his arm around each of their shoulders and he says, gentlemen, you're going to have peace, because if you don't have peace, we're going to come over with our fleet and we're going to make peace. And so he intimidates them into a peace agreement, and ironically ends up being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. So here is just another example of Teddy Roosevelt's political style and his genius. He threatens two major countries in the world into a peace agreement, and he gets awarded a peace prize for that. Final element of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick foreign policy is his use of the Great White Fleet. This is a fleet of modern steel battleships, all painted white, and he sends them out on a world tour to stop at important ports all around the world to show off American military might. And again, this is a way of subtly intimidating other countries to let them know that the United States has firepower and the United States has a modern navy and is willing to use it. And it's so admired because of his negotiation of the peace treaty that when the fleet gets to Japan, school children meet it at the docks and sing songs. I think some of them even were noted to have been singing the American national anthem. And so here is Teddy Roosevelt using militaristic power and a veiled threat to the rest of the world that the United States will now be the world police force if necessary. I'm going to end it there for now. There is one last piece about William Howard Taft's foreign policy of dollar diplomacy, but we'll get into that discussion when we talk about Taft's presidency in a later lesson. Enjoy the rest of your day.